Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She was just 3 days away from her 50th birthday. Joanne Samak had booked the tickets, reserved a hotel in Paris, and was preparing to leave behind a marriage that had long stopped feeling safe. But on July 1st, 2024, in the early hours of the morning, everything went silent. At 4:02 a.m., a man, her husband, called 911. He told the dispatcher his wife had stabbed herself 6 times while asleep. By the time responders arrived, Joanne wasn't breathing. Her blood had already cooled, and the knife? It wasn't anywhere near the bed. This wasn't a remote village or a forgotten city. This was Droitwich Spa, a quiet English town where people greet each other on the street, where neighbors notice if your car hasn't moved, and where murders aren't just crimes. They dismantle the illusion of safety behind closed doors. The Samaks lived in a modest 2-story brick home on a residential cul-de-sac lined with hydrangeas and motion sensor lights. Joanne was well known among locals as a self-made interior designer. She was articulate, meticulous, and respected. A planner by nature, she didn't leave things to chance. That week, she had finalized a new client proposal, sent flowers to her sister in Devon, and texted a friend about getting her hair done before Paris. Her browser history showed a search for top-rated restaurants in Montmartre. There was no sign, not one, of a woman planning to end her life. The husband, Mohammed Samak, was 42. A former field hockey coach at Malvern College, he'd been unemployed for months. On paper, there were no complaints, no arrests, no calls for domestic incidents. But that's not the same as peace. Friends described him as polite, sometimes distant. Joanne's tone when she spoke about him had shifted over time, from neutral to guarded. In June, she told a close friend, "He doesn't yell, he doesn't hit, but something about the way he watches me, it's cold." According to Muhammad's statement to first responders, he woke up sometime after 3 o'clock a.m. and found Joanne in the bathroom bleeding. He claimed she had stabbed herself in a moment of despair, that she struggled with her mental health, and that she was under a lot of pressure about the business. He said he panicked and froze, only calling 911 almost an hour later. But the crime scene told a different story. Joanne was found in bed, flat on her back. She had no pulse. Her arms lay by her sides, palms upward. 6 stab wounds, one of them penetrating her heart, and no signs of movement or struggle. No defensive injuries, no signs of hesitation, no overturned furniture. The sheets were barely disturbed. Her nightgown was soaked, but the mattress wasn't. An early indicator the bleeding had occurred rapidly and perhaps elsewhere. There was no knife in the room. Paramedics noted that the scene felt staged. Mohammed, who opened the door in pajama pants and a hoodie, had no visible blood on him. His voice was level. He led them upstairs. He didn't follow. One medic later told investigators, "She was gone, long gone. That wasn't someone who just died. That was someone who'd been lying there for a while." The delay in calling emergency services became the first red flag. While Mohammed was transported for voluntary questioning, a forensic team began initial processing. Luminol revealed faint traces of blood on the staircase leading from the bedroom down to the laundry area. The kitchen and living room showed no signs of disturbance. Nothing was missing. No forced entry. The Ring camera mounted outside had no footage between 2:45 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., deleted manually. Investigators began mapping a timeline. Based on post-mortem cooling and livor mortis patterns, the medical examiner estimated time of death between 3 o'clock and 3:20 a.m. That placed Joanne's death at least 40 minutes before the 911 call. Her phone, recovered from the bedside table, showed no outgoing calls after 11:12 p.m. the night before. But it did show a calendar entry at 8:30 a.m. Check passport plus print Eurostar. That morning, the town of Droitwich Spa awoke to news of a woman found dead in her own home. But the real story hadn't started yet. Investigators now had a body, a delayed emergency call, and a husband whose version of events didn't match the physics of the scene. They also had a silent woman in bed, a woman who had planned to leave the country, not leave the world. At first glance, Mohammed Samak didn't appear out of place. He looked like any man standing in his doorway at 4 in the morning, tired, disheveled, pale under the porch light. But the silence in the room where his wife lay dead, the absence of blood on his hands, the composed tone of his voice, those things didn't match the image of a frantic spouse waking up to a fatal domestic tragedy. Investigators didn't act on instinct. They don't rely on gut feelings alone, but they do notice when a scene feels manufactured, when the emotional notes are too perfectly absent. It wasn't what he said, one officer later remarked. It was what he didn't. Joanne Samak had been stabbed 6 times, and Muhammad claimed she did it to herself. But there were no signs she had moved around the house. No trail of panic. No chaos. Her body was found precisely laid on the bed, with the covers pulled halfway over her knees. She didn't crawl. She didn't scream. And the knife wasn't even in the room. As the forensic team logged every square inch of the home, a second team began its review of the couple's background. Joanne had lived in Worcestershire her entire life. She started her own design consultancy from scratch in her 30s, built it slowly, and developed a loyal client base across the region. There were no prior police reports, no restraining orders, but absence of documentation isn't evidence of peace. Joanne's close circle described her as decisive, independent, and private. She rarely shared personal frustrations, especially not about her marriage. But in the final months before her death, that began to change. One friend reported that Joanne had confided in her over coffee. She told me, "He's watching everything now. He asks who I talk to, why I'm out late, who I email. I feel boxed in." Another described a phone call where Joanne admitted she had begun transferring money into a separate account. That detail would become relevant later. Muhammad, by contrast, had seen a very different trajectory. Once employed as a field hockey coach at Malvern College, his contract had ended the previous year. There was no formal termination on file, but colleagues described his demeanor as withdrawn and aloof. He had not secured new work since. According to financial records subpoenaed in the early days of the investigation, Muhammad had no active income at the time of Joanne's death. Joanne was the sole provider for the household. All mortgage payments, utilities, and business expenses were in her name. Muhammad had no personal bank account attached to employment income since late 2023. While financial dependency is not a crime, it becomes relevant in cases where control is leveraged quietly, strategically. Several of Joanne's emails retrieved later from her professional inbox showed subtle concern. In one message to a client dated June 18th, she wrote, "Apologies for the delay. It's been tricky juggling timelines. Some things at home have been complicated lately." That same week, Muhammad emailed the same client under Joanne's email address, offering to reschedule a consultation. He was not part of her business. That email was not something Joanne authorized. Digital forensic teams flagged this. Device access logs indicated that Muhammad had opened her MacBook on multiple occasions during off hours. The pattern showed late-night access between midnight and 2 a.m. to Joanne's work files and personal calendar. No passwords were broken, but he had them. That, in itself, was a form of surveillance. Police didn't yet have enough for a charge, but patterns were forming. Joanne had been slowly moving toward financial independence. Muhammad had no work, no assets, and a growing awareness that Joanne intended to change something. One investigator phrased it this way: he was losing ground. Quietly, she was preparing to leave the structure he relied on. And then she didn't wake up. There was another detail worth noting. Joanne had taken out a life insurance policy in 2018, shortly after their wedding anniversary. Muhammad was the primary beneficiary. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had contacted the provider and requested documents to change the beneficiary to a cousin living abroad. The paperwork was never finalized. According to the insurer, she had not returned the signed form. In most investigations, motive takes time to solidify. In this one, investigators didn't need to speculate. The structure was there: financial control, digital overreach, dependent relationship, pending loss of access to money. Joanne's death wasn't the beginning of something. It was the interruption of a process she had already started. She'd bought the train tickets to Paris. She'd changed the locks on the studio. She had scheduled meetings with 2 attorneys, one for business restructuring, the other for personal transition. Those were her words, not theirs. But then, in the early morning hours of July 1st, 2024, that transition was cut short. The challenge in cases like this isn't proving something happened. It's proving who made it happen and how. Joanne's phone history showed no signs of distress, no suicidal ideation, no calls to mental health support. She had plans, measurable, traceable plans. The forensic audit of the home was still ongoing, but the digital trail was speaking clearly. Mohammed had access, he had motive, and he had no other source of financial security. By the end of day 3, investigators had compiled a list of anomalies: unauthorized email access to Joanne's client base, deleted Ring camera footage from the hours surrounding the incident, inconsistent statements from Mohammed about Joanne's mental health, attempted control over financial resources he didn't own. Each item on its own wasn't enough, but together they painted a profile, not of a man in mourning, but of one who was being outpaced. As one detective noted, sometimes you don't need bruises to know someone's being squeezed. There's something clinical about a crime scene when it's too clean, not physically. Blood was present, but contextually. Too still, too intact. When a violent death takes place, most rooms bear witness in some way. Furniture shifts, walls are marked, panic leaves signs. But in the Samak residence, the bedroom where Joanne died remained almost undisturbed. On the morning of July 1, 2024, the West Mercia Police Forensic Team entered the property with the task of breaking that silence. A body had been found, a story had been told, and now it was time to assess whether the physical evidence supported the words. Joanne was lying on her back, fully clothed in sleepwear. The blanket covered her legs but had been folded at the knees. Her arms rested along her sides. The 6 stab wounds were all on the torso, clustered, deliberate, and not haphazard. A single wound penetrated her heart, likely fatal within seconds. The problem wasn't just the precision, it was the complete absence of resistance. No defensive injuries on her arms, no scratches or broken fingernails, no blood spatter consistent with the struggle. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't moved. The bedding was undisturbed, corners still tucked under the mattress. The pillowcase beneath her head showed no signs of compression or shifting. Investigators noted that the body's position, combined with lividity, indicated she had died where she lay, but no knife was present. There was one detail that stood out early. The base of the victim's feet were clean. No trace of blood. No sign she had stood or walked through the home after the injuries occurred. That contradicted the statement provided by her husband, that she had gone to the bathroom and collapsed. If she had moved after the stabbing, forensic technicians would expect smearing, footprints, or at minimum, blood transfer through the soles. Instead, a small trail of diluted blood droplets extended from the bedroom doorway to the laundry room downstairs, inconsistent with arterial spray, more in line with passive transfer. Investigators photographed and logged the pattern. A technician noted the droplets were spaced in an unusual rhythm, almost evenly placed. Not random, not panicked, he recorded in his field notes. In the laundry room, located just off the back hallway, a stainless steel kitchen knife was found inside the sink. It had been rinsed but not thoroughly cleaned. Under forensic light, trace blood residue remained along the blade's lower edge and inside the serrated groove near the handle. Lab testing later confirmed it was Joanne's blood. There were no fingerprints on the knife handle. The sink drain tested positive for blood remnants, suggesting someone had attempted to wash it, though not with bleach or industrial cleaners. The knife's location raised a serious timeline issue. If Joanne had walked herself to the laundry room after stabbing herself, then returned to bed to die, it would conflict with her foot cleanliness and the liver pattern. If she had somehow thrown the knife downstairs from the bedroom, there should have been blood traces on the hallway wall or stairs. None were found. One senior crime scene investigator posed the question directly in his report. If the victim died in bed and the knife was in the laundry room, who moved it? They searched for any indication the knife had been stored in that room previously. The Samak's kitchen, where the rest of the knife set was located, sat on the opposite side of the home. The matched knife block, a standard 6-piece stainless steel set, was missing one knife. The rest were clean and dry. Surveillance footage from the Ring doorbell was unavailable during the incident window. The system's last functioning log entry occurred at 2:43 a.m. Device rebooted. It did not reactivate until 4:15 a.m. after first responders arrived. Mohammed's explanation? He claimed it was glitching. Technical review showed a manual factory reset. Inside Joanne's bedside drawer, investigators found a train itinerary printed on June 29th. She was set to leave for Paris on July 4th. Underneath the ticket, a handwritten list: book return flight transfer studio keys, confirm insurance transfer, speak to MS Ulm. Final. The last line caught attention. MS. Mohammed Samak, her husband. The man who said she'd taken her own life. Digital evidence from Mohammed's phone, processed that same week, showed no emergency searches, no frantic calls or browsing about medical response, suicide support, or first aid. Instead, logs indicated a 27-minute period where no applications were accessed at all, from 3:12 a.m. to 3:39 a.m. That silence overlapped with the estimated time of death. This absence became its own data point. The data aligned too cleanly, one investigator later said. Sometimes that's the problem. By the fourth day of investigation, West Mercia police had three anchors to their developing theory. Joanne died in bed, stab wounds, lividity, lack of movement, all consistent. The weapon was relocated, with no physical way for Joanne to have moved it post-mortem. There was no sign of intruder entry, and no evidence she had gotten out of bed alive. The house had told its version. Quietly. The knife didn't scream, the floor didn't resist, but the logic held together like clockwork. For investigators trained in domestic homicide cases, this pattern was familiar, not because of how much evidence there was, but because of how consistent it became. The closer they examined the scene, the more the room rejected the idea of self-inflicted harm. Joanne had not moved. The room had not moved. The story had moved. As one detective phrased it, people don't die that cleanly, not unless someone else takes care of the mess. The home on Tudor Lane had no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, and no missing items. From the outside, everything looked undisturbed. But in digital forensics, surface calm doesn't mean nothing happened. It just means someone tried to erase the truth. After processing the crime scene and collecting the knife from the downstairs utility sink, the digital unit began a deeper sweep. Focus shifted to the Ring surveillance system installed near the main entry. The doorbell camera was still intact, mounted firmly and powered, but there was one major problem. It had no footage from the critical window. Between 2:45 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., the hour when Joanne was believed to have died. The recovery team reviewed the camera's event log. According to the system's own diagnostics, it had been manually reset at 2:43 a.m. This was not a power failure or motion trigger issue. This was a hard reboot, the kind that requires physical interaction with the device, pressing and holding the reset button for over 10 seconds. That kind of action doesn't happen by accident. Mohammed had claimed the system wasn't working and that he never trusted it fully. But in the days leading up to July 1st, there were no documented issues. The app recorded motion alerts, mail deliveries, and Joanne coming and going regularly. The system had been functioning normally until the early hours of the day she died. Metadata from the Ring app account tied to Mohammed's phone showed it was accessed at 2:41 a.m. That alone didn't prove intent. But paired with the hard reset 2 minutes later and the absence of footage during the time of death, it formed a pattern. The digital trail had gaps, but gaps are still information. Joanne's own device told a more detailed story. Her iPhone, recovered from the nightstand, was not locked with Face ID, but instead used a 6-digit passcode, a setting commonly changed by users concerned about privacy. The last outgoing message was sent the night before at 10:54 p.m., confirming a taxi booking to the train station for July 4th. But deeper analysis revealed something else. On June 28th, Joanne had installed a file encryption app, a tool often used to store sensitive documents privately. Investigators with a digital warrant extracted its contents. Inside, they found screenshots of an email exchange between Joanne and her insurance provider. In the email, dated June 26th, Joanne had formally requested a change of beneficiary. Mohammed was to be removed, and a cousin listed in his place. The form had not yet been returned, but the timing of the request, just 5 days before her death, was flagged as highly significant. Alongside the insurance email was a screenshot of a WhatsApp conversation now deleted from the app itself. Recovered through the encrypted backup, the message read, If anything happens suddenly, I want you to know I was trying to change things. I just need time. That one line added weight to a growing timeline. Joanne had booked a trip, moved money, drafted legal transitions, and expressed fear in private channels, all before the morning she was found dead. Digital forensics teams also extracted Mohammed's device logs. One anomaly stood out. Between 3:10 a.m. and 3:39 a.m., a time frame consistent with the estimated time of death, his phone was active, but no outgoing messages or calls were made. Instead, screen time logs showed the device was open to the settings menu. For 22 minutes, he stayed on that screen. No other app was accessed. No 911 call, no Google searches for emergency response. Just system settings. It wasn't conclusive. But to the lead investigator, it didn't sit right. "You don't stare at a settings screen while your spouse is bleeding out," he said in a post-report briefing, "unless you're making a choice not to look at anything else." From a technical standpoint, Mohammed's account credentials had administrative access to both the camera and Joanne's shared home Wi-Fi. That meant he could reboot the Ring system, modify user permissions, or delete logs entirely. However, Ring stores motion trigger metadata in the cloud. Even if footage is lost or overwritten, timestamps remain. The system had registered a motion alert at 3:06 a.m., just before the time Joanne was believed to have died. What triggered that alert remains unknown. No video was recovered, but the time entry could not be removed. It was the digital equivalent of a footprint. The camera was later removed and analyzed in lab conditions. No hardware failure was found. Forensic teams also pulled router logs. Mohammed had disconnected the router's power at 3:07 a.m., then plugged it back in at 3:11. That reset cycle matched the Ring blackout. It was a small detail, 4 minutes of network silence, but it aligned precisely with a time window during which no other devices in the home recorded activity. Combined, the data painted a clear picture. The surveillance system had been tampered with intentionally. The home network had been reset. The device logs showed actions, not reactions. There were no signs of panic, no digital breadcrumbs of someone trying to save a dying spouse. Just silence, followed by calibration. From the outside, the house looked untouched, but from the inside, digitally, it had been rewritten. These weren't the kinds of mistakes a stranger would make. A break-in wouldn't require resetting cameras or switching network cables. These were actions taken by someone who lived there, someone who had access, someone who understood what the systems could see and how to make them stop seeing. One investigator later summarized the findings bluntly. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was intentional. There's a specific silence that takes over a crime scene once the noise of sirens fades and the body's been moved. For South Yorkshire investigators, that silence was shattered 3 days into the Joanne Samak case, not by a confession, not by a witness, but by an inconsistency that surfaced in the forensics. On the morning of February 4, 2024, a second sweep of the Samak residence was ordered. Not because anything had been missed, but because too much had lined up too cleanly. It was Detective Inspector Hannah Kershaw's call. She wasn't satisfied with Mohammed's version of events, an impulsive act, a blackout, a moment of rage. The crime scene lacked the hallmarks of chaos. The bloodstains were centralized. The weapon was wiped, the body unmoved. But in the garage, hidden beneath a tarp-covered shelving unit, luminol lit up what appeared to be small blood droplets. DNA testing later confirmed the blood belonged to Joanne. It wasn't in a volume that suggested the garage was the murder site, but it was enough to raise a question. What was Joanne's blood doing in a location Mohammed claimed she never entered that night? Simultaneously, pathology reports from the Home Office Forensic Pathology Service arrived. Joanne's autopsy revealed 7 stab wounds, 5 of them clustered around the ribcage, consistent with intent to kill. But 2 wounds on her left forearm were deemed defensive. It was a critical finding. Mohammed had claimed Joanne was asleep during the attack. If she had fought back, she'd been awake, or at least aware. That shifted the narrative. Mohammed hadn't blacked out in a burst of uncontrolled rage. He'd engaged in a controlled, sustained attack. Digital forensics followed quickly. Joanne's phone, recovered from the bedside table, held more than deleted texts. Encrypted backup records showed recent searches. How to remove spouse from insurance, divorce process UK, and, most damning, if I die, can my husband still get my insurance? The last search had been conducted just 5 days before the murder. One recovered text sent to a friend on January 28th read, "If anything happens to me, tell the police to look at the policy." Mohammed had deleted the message. Investigators confirmed he accessed Joanne's phone roughly 40 minutes after the estimated time of death, long enough for rigor to begin, short enough to still control the scene. That phone activity also triggered scrutiny of the life insurance policy. Joanne had taken out a $400,000 policy 8 months earlier. Mohammed was the sole beneficiary. There were no suicide exclusions. The policy had recently updated address and contact verification. Oddly, that verification had been logged from Mohammed's laptop IP address, not Joanne's mobile, as was typical. By this point, investigators were no longer operating in ambiguity. The case had moved from theory to structure. Mohammed's financial records showed multiple credit card debts, missed payments on a second mortgage, and a recent search history on annuities and payout timelines. Joanne's financial life, by contrast, included a hidden Halifax savings account, newly opened, funded with a lump sum transfer, and linked to a rental application. She'd been preparing to leave. From a prosecutorial lens, that mattered. Joanne wasn't simply the victim of a bad marriage. She was in the process of escape. That action, coupled with her research, her hidden money, and her text to a friend, created what the Crown Prosecution Service would later call a pattern of imminent risk awareness. To reinforce motive, detectives reached out to Mohammed's prior colleagues in youth hockey. The goal wasn't character assassination, it was behavioral history. Several statements describe Mohammed as rigid, image-driven, and tightly controlled under stress. One described a verbal altercation at a youth match where Mohammed had allegedly shoved a linesman. It had never been reported. But it spoke to impulse and intensity, both relevant to prosecutors building psychological framing. Despite a growing stack of evidence, Mohammed's legal team attempted to reframe the narrative. They suggested the attack was a spontaneous, emotional break, but the details pushed back. The clean knife, the time-stamped phone access, the garage blood, the deleted text, and the financial prep on both sides. These weren't the elements of a momentary lapse. At this point in the case, the public had started following the trial coverage, and it's worth noting how quickly the tide turned. At first, many questioned the media's portrayal. Mohammed had no prior record. He was well-spoken, professionally respected. But now the image fractured. One local paper ran the headline, "Calculated Silence, What Mohammed Didn't Say." As investigators finalized their brief, it became clear this wasn't about a man pushed to a breaking point. This was about a man watching the life he controlled begin to slip and choosing, methodically, to eliminate the variable. There's a particular shift in atmosphere when a homicide case moves from crime scene management to criminal prosecution. It's no longer about what happened. It becomes a question of who is responsible, how do we prove it, and what's the motive. In the case of Joanne Samak's death, that shift began precisely 11 days after her body was recovered from the bedroom she once shared with her husband, Mohammed Samak. By then, most of the forensic results had returned. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that Joanne was attacked while lying flat, partially turned toward her left side, with no sign of movement afterward. The angle and trajectory of the stab wounds, 12 in total, suggested a calculated assault rather than a frenzied act. The killer had struck with force, not panic. But for Detective Inspector Hannah Kershaw, the physical evidence was only one layer. The deeper layer was intent, and it was Mohammed's digital trail that began forming a web impossible to ignore. On February 10, 2024, detectives served a warrant for full extraction of Mohammed's cloud backups. Among the retrieved data, multiple deleted web searches in late January 2024, including phrases like, "Can you cash out life insurance if spouse is missing?" and "knife wound fatality time of death." Days before Joanne's death, there were notes typed into his phone that read more like risk assessments than a grieving husband's to-do list. One such note, "Call AXA. Need clarity on clause if accidental versus natural. Confirmed date of last premium update." Investigators were also able to recover fragments of WhatsApp conversations between Mohammed and a woman named CL, later confirmed as a 32-year-old nurse from a private hospital in London. The chats were suggestive of an emotional affair, but more notably, they included discussions about starting a new life in Dubai, free from burdens. One message sent just 36 hours before Joanne's death read, "This is the last wall between us. I need courage, but I'm close." To the average person, it might have seemed cryptic. But in the context of a violent domestic homicide and a pending insurance payout of £408,000, it was chilling. By mid-February, the Crown Prosecution Service had seen enough to formally charge Mohammed Samak with murder. He was arrested on the evening of February 17th while returning to his vehicle from a community gym in Surrey. The arrest was calm. He didn't resist, didn't ask why. He simply asked, "Is this about Joanne?" The grand jury proceedings began behind closed doors shortly after. In parallel, Mohammed's defense solicitor initiated a public relations effort to paint Joanne as mentally unstable, hinting at a potential self-harm theory that had never aligned with any of the forensic facts. The narrative was weak. Even the preliminary toxicology reports had confirmed Joanne had no alcohol, sedatives, or mood stabilizers in her system at the time of death. The blood patterns on the sheets told a story the defense couldn't silence. Still, the system required process, and Mohammed, once a respected junior hockey coach and community mentor, was now a murder defendant under maximum security remand awaiting indictment. For those following the case closely, one question lingered. Why now? Why would a man with no documented history of violent outbursts, a stable public career, and no financial bankruptcy risk turn to such an act? That's where the prosecution began focusing, on control, not desperation. Joanne had recently started working full-time again, gaining financial independence. She'd also updated her will in December 2023, removing Mohammed as her sole beneficiary, replacing him with her younger sister. Mohammed may have discovered that change. If he did, the insurance policy's utility would have vanished, and so would the motive. But instead, he acted preemptively. Forensic accounting reports later noted a peculiar pattern. Mohammed had increased Joanne's policy contributions in October 2023, just weeks after she hinted at separation in a counseling session. There was no outward sign of divorce, no court filings. But inside the home, the distance had grown. Detectives would later conclude that Joanne's murder was likely a premeditated financial decision masked by domestic routine. As for Mohammed, he maintained silence post-arrest. Not denial, not confession, just calculated silence. His bail request was denied. When investigators returned to the Samak residence for a third walkthrough in early June 2024, it wasn't a new clue that brought them back. It was the lack of one. The crime scene was unusually clean, almost too clean for a house where a brutal stabbing had occurred while someone slept. The mattress had been disposed of. The fitted sheets were missing. The murder weapon, a long, narrow kitchen blade, had been wiped down and placed back into the knife block. No visible fingerprints, no signs of struggle in the room. For a homicide that was both intimate and violent, the absence of chaos was, ironically, the most alarming sign. In my experience reviewing domestic homicides, the scene almost always mirrors the rage or desperation of the killer. Here, the opposite was true. It was sterile, almost staged. That's when investigators started to question not just what happened, but when it was planned. The forensic timeline was key. Joanne Samak had been stabbed in her sleep sometime between 1:15 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. based on preliminary liver temperature and lividity progression from the coroner's early notes. She was found around 6:45 a.m. when emergency services were called by Mohammed Samak. He claimed he had woken up and found her covered in blood. Yet the autopsy report, finalized on June 12th, concluded that rigor mortis was fully established, placing the time of death closer to 2 a.m. That didn't match his account of just discovering her moments before calling. More inconsistencies surfaced. Mohammed told first responders he attempted CPR, yet paramedics noted that her airway was obstructed by dried blood and there was no evidence of recent chest compressions, no bruising to the sternum, no disturbed clothing, no displaced furniture in the room. She had died in bed, her body still lying flat, with her hands folded under her cheek, just as if she had never woken up. In his first formal interview, Mohammed repeatedly referred to Joanne in the past tense. She was a strong woman. She used to be kind. A small detail, yes, But seasoned investigators know that language often betrays intent. And in this case, his detachment wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. At this point, detectives began digging into Mohammed's financials, not for speculation, but to establish whether there was a monetary motive. One of the first red flags was a life insurance policy taken out in Joanne's name just 10 months prior, £385,000 in total coverage. The beneficiary, Mohammed Samak. This wasn't illegal, of course, but the timing and scale of the policy, paired with her sudden death, brought it under heavy scrutiny. A second issue was the existence of a prior claim. Mohammed had previously attempted to cash out part of the policy on grounds of financial hardship, despite still being employed part-time as a hockey coach. The request was denied due to policy restrictions, but the paper trail remained, a window into financial strain and possibly desperation. One officer noted, "It wasn't a crime of passion. There was no yelling, no threats, no escalating domestic reports. This felt clinical, like it had been worked out in his head long before he ever picked up the knife." And yet, despite the forensic indicators and the circumstantial pressure closing in, there was still no confession, no eyewitness, no direct video evidence. The Ring doorbell at their front entrance hadn't been operational in weeks. Joanne's phone, curiously, had been factory reset sometime during the early morning hours, an action confirmed by a mobile forensic analysis pulled from her iCloud backup. That deletion, however, was partial. While messages and call logs had been wiped, fragments of emails, including one draft to her sister about something off in her marriage, were recoverable, but nothing conclusive. In a case like this, the lack of a single smoking gun didn't weaken the prosecution. It forced them to rely on the cold consistency of evidence. From the cleanup pattern to the insurance angle, from the CPR inconsistencies to digital tampering, every piece leaned in the same direction: a methodical removal of obstacles, an attempt to rewrite the crime scene. If this truly was an act of sudden violence, why did it look so much like a plan? As one of the investigators quietly observed, "You don't clean up panic, you clean up purpose." The days following Mohammed Samak's formal arrest were deliberately clinical, each hour packed with tasks that would later become chapters in the prosecution's case file. There was no room for assumption now, no space for speculation. The truth, stripped bare, had to be built from evidence, every trace, every bite, every dollar. The digital forensic team retrieved backups from Joanne's phone cloud account. Though the device itself was wiped shortly after her death, its SIM removed and reformatted, investigators pulled up her WhatsApp backups, email recovery logs, and banking alerts stored remotely. What they found dismantled any remaining illusions about what had occurred in that house. 2 weeks prior to her murder, Joanne had sent a discreet inquiry to an independent insurance broker. The message was short. "Can you confirm who the named beneficiary is on my current life insurance policy? I believe my husband has recently altered it." The broker replied 2 days later, confirming that Mohammed Samak had recently requested changes to the policy, adding himself as the sole beneficiary for the full payout, £480,000. Joanne had never signed the updated paperwork. Alongside that message was a screen recording she'd taken from her own banking app, capturing Mohammed transferring money out of a joint account in the middle of the night. That same account, ironically, had paid the premium for her life insurance just days before she was stabbed. The coroner's report was already damning. Joanne had been asleep when the knife entered her chest. No signs of defense, no struggle. She hadn't expected it, hadn't even stirred. Toxicology showed a low but detectable level of zopiclone in her system, a prescription sedative. The dosage wasn't enough to raise suspicion on its own, but it was high enough to explain her immobility. The prosecution's case began to crystallize not from one smoking gun, but from the convergence of small methodical actions. Deleted browser history showed Mohammed had searched "how long for zopiclone to act" and "insurance payout if spouse dies in sleep." The timestamps matched the same night he had last coached a local amateur hockey session, an alibi that crumbled once his location data placed him at home 3 hours earlier than he claimed. But what sealed the final break was not a technical clue. It came from Joanne's best friend Rachel, whose statement was nearly overlooked. She had received a voice message from Joanne 3 nights before the incident. In it, Joanne sounded flat, almost numb. She said, "If anything happens to me, don't believe he had nothing to do with it. I don't feel safe anymore." Joanne never filed a police report. She never told her family. She didn't run. Perhaps she thought it would pass. Or perhaps, like many victims of coercive control, she didn't think anyone would believe her. But in the end, her quiet foresight left behind a trail, subtle, careful, and damning. During the trial at Crown Court in early 2025, Mohammed pled not guilty. His defense framed the killing as a moment of uncontrollable rage during an argument, denying any premeditation. The judge disagreed. After 10 days of testimony, a jury found him guilty of murder. The planning, the altered insurance documents, the sedatives, the deletion of evidence, none of it could be dismissed as impulsive. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 26 years. There was no visible reaction from Mohammed when the sentence was read, just a stiff jaw and eyes that never once looked toward Joanne's family. As I stood outside the courthouse that day, I thought about how silence can speak louder than anything else. Joanne didn't leave behind a dramatic escape or a viral video diary. She left behind a few digital traces, a quiet plea to a friend, and an unshakable truth buried in code. That was all. But it was enough. Too many stories like hers never make it to court. Too many are buried in medical records, masked by polite conversations and smiling photos. But justice, when it comes, isn't always loud. Sometimes it is built one line of code, one voice message, one forgotten screenshot at a time. They say hindsight is 20/20, but in Joanne's case, the warnings were clear, just quiet. If I could say one thing after walking through her story, it's this. Silence doesn't mean safety. If you feel something is wrong, trust that instinct, document it, speak up. Because justice often starts with just one person believing their voice matters. What do you think we can learn from Joanne's story? Have you ever witnessed signs that were brushed aside? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Whether you're watching from New York, Texas, or anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let me know. If this story moved you or made you think twice, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next case. And if it didn't, tell me why. Tell me where you're watching from. This space is for all of us.